Hi everybody, this is Rick Kafori with the Boston and Maine Railroad Historical Society. Welcome back. We're back again with another virtual presentation here for you. Took a little bit of a break to kind of get some material together and draw up some plans for some more videos and presentations, but we're here with a really special video for you today. So throughout the whole stay-at-home process, one of my personal projects has been cleaning and scanning and digitizing the Dana Goodwin color slide collection, which right now I'm almost finished with it. It stands at about 4,200 slides total that I've scanned, and a good deal of that is Boston and Maine and New England content, which is relevant and of interest to our society, but quite a majority of the collection deals with railroads from around the country and in Canada as well. We've mentioned this in some of our previous presentations, but Dana Goodwin was a prolific photographer from Fitchburg, Massachusetts. He was a member of many different enthusiasts groups and fan clubs, and he would travel around the country and into Canada as well with friends of his, namely John Goodwin, who was of no relation to him, and H. Arnold Wilder as well. They would travel and get photographs. So while I've been scanning this collection, I've kind of come to realize that not only is this a treasure for New England railroads and Boston and Maine fans, but really just scenes from around the country of an era that is no longer visible in railroading. And there's some really fantastic content, much of which has never been digitized or scanned or even seen in large audiences before. So that's part of what we're doing here today, showing some of that history. We're going to take a trip. We're calling it the Great American Rail Trip. We're starting out on the Boston and Maine in Fitchburg, and we're going to travel around the country and back and forth in time as well. Some of the shots are taken in different decades, but they're interspersed by location. So we're going to go on a little rail trip and see what we can find. So we're going to start here in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, of course Dana's hometown. East Fitchburg specifically is where the B&M's engine facility was located. And we see here in May 1949, Boston and Maine 462 P4 class Pacific locomotive number 3713, the Constitution, which of course still exists today, and it's down at Steamtown National Historic Site in Scranton, Pennsylvania, being restored. And we actually got the chance to go and tour that last year and take a look at their progress, and it's coming along very successfully. So it's going to be a really great landmark event for the Boston and Maine and for rail fans all over the country. We're going to move out west on the Boston and Maine. We're going to continue along the Fitchburg division of the Boston and Maine out to Wachusett, Massachusetts, which is on the hill just out of Fitchburg. And we have here a sister engine to the 3713, number 3710, named the Peter Cooper, leading a passenger train westbound on the Fitchburg division. Now, the Boston and Maine's P4s were ordered in the 1930s. The Boston and Maine was one of the few railroads that were able to order new power during the Great Depression. They got these Pacifics in the 1930s, and they actually had a contest for school children in the Boston area to name them. And they came up with different names like the Constitution, Peter Cooper, which were then applied to the side of the locomotives with nameplates. So pretty neat piece of Boston and Maine history there, but this is one of Dana's color photographs, and this dates from the late 1940s as well. We're going to keep heading west on the Fitchburg division on our trip here. We're at South Ashburnham, Massachusetts, right at the crest of Ashburnham Hill and the curve there. This is April 1970. We've got a road freight heading west behind three Bluebird Boston and Maine GP9s, number 1732, 1798, 1714. And you can see just to the left of the lead engine, that's the Cheshire branch leaving the main line, heading up through southwestern New Hampshire into Bellows Falls, Massachusetts. So we're going to continue up the Cheshire branch to Keene, New Hampshire. Here we are in downtown Keene in 1962. Now, F. Nelson Blount was a railroad enthusiast and a millionaire from Rhode Island, and his dream was to own and operate steam locomotives, and he had a very impressive private collection of steam locomotives, which he amassed. And one of his first operations was operating on the Cheshire branch out of Keene, New Hampshire. Now, that was only in 1962. In 1961, he had operated on the Claremont-Concord branch out of Lake Sunapee with a different locomotive, and that didn't work out, so they moved to Keene, New Hampshire, and tried to run Steamtown which was the organization that Blount had started out of Keene. Unfortunately, politics got in the way, and even though Keene was an ideal location for the museum, it didn't happen. So they moved to North Walpole, New Hampshire, right on the border of Vermont, right where the Cheshire branch comes to an end across the river from Bellows Falls. So we're going to continue there in 1964, which is the season of Steamtown, which operated out of North Walpole into Vermont. So we're here in 1964. Number 15 was a 280 consolidation type locomotive built for the Oneida and Western Railroad in Tennessee, and later worked for the Rahway Valley in New Jersey. And this is under Blount's ownership. The yellow wood coaches you see here were, most of them were salvaged from the Boston and Maine's work train equipment, which were former wooden passenger coaches, which Blount painted an attractive shade of yellow. And there's the man himself, the man from Steamtown, Nelson Blount, in the cab of number 15. He was always at the throttle of the locomotive during the Steamtown trips. He was a qualified engineer. He actually had taken the engineer's test from the Boston and Maine. Unfortunately, about 3 years later, Blount was killed. He was also an airplane enthusiast, and he would fly his private plane from Steamtown in Bellows Falls to his home in Dublin, New Hampshire. And he was still dressed in his engineer garb one day, didn't notice that the plane was low on fuel, and the plane went down pretty close to his home in Dublin, and he was killed. Steamtown, of course, continued on in Bellows Falls for another decade and a half or so until 1983-84, when they auctioned off quite a bit of the collection and moved to Scranton, Pennsylvania. Now we're going to continue into the state of New York. We're going to continue through Vermont into New York State. We have the Delaware and Hudson Railroad of New York, which was a very famous railroad. It was actually owned briefly by English interests, which explains why some of its steam locomotives had a bit more of a European appearance to them. But Dana shot the Delaware and Hudson quite often, and here we have a double-headed steam trip. This looks like it is a passenger run behind 280 consolidation number 606 on the Delaware and Hudson. Unfortunately, this slide wasn't located or dated. Some of the slides in Dana's collection were detailed quite a bit after he passed away, so some of the information isn't included, unfortunately, but this is in New York on the Delaware and Hudson. Then we're going to move to Mechanicville, New York, which is at the very end of the Boston and Maine's Fitchburg division, and the D&H also ran there as well. We've got Pacific, a 462 Pacific, number 603 here in Mechanicville. Fantastic color shot, Delaware and Hudson locomotive, and you can kind of see some of that European influence on the locomotive design. So the D&H had a very unique style of steam locomotives. But we're going to stay in Mechanicville for our next shot, which shows two Alco RS2 locomotives in Mechanicville. The Delaware and Hudson dieselized pretty early, and the Alco RS2 was one of their original diesel locomotives. Eventually they were painted gray and blue with a yellow lightning stripe, but this is the very first scheme they were in, the black with yellow lettering. Going to stay in the state of New York, but we're going to wind the clock ahead a little bit here. We're at Albany Rensselaer, New York in June of 1969. We've got New York Central EMD E8A number 4072. This is a passenger train on the New York Central right before the Penn Central takeover, which was a merger, of course, between the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad. One of the most controversial mergers in history. Actually ended in a massive bankruptcy, which was the largest bankruptcy in American history up to that point in time. But this is right before that. This is a New York Central passenger train at the Albany Rensselaer Station in New York State. And keeping up with the New York Central theme here, we're going to continue to Fonda, New York on the New York Central. We have New York Central 484 Niagara type, number 6002, in 1951 on the New York Central at Fonda. And you actually can see here, if you look closely, between the rails there's a water pan, and they're actually watering the locomotive on the fly. This was set up so the engine could take water without having to stop at a water tank. So that's what they're doing here, and you didn't see very many pictures of that, and you especially didn't see very many color pictures of that, but Dana was there to take the scene for us. Fonda, New York was also the point where the Fonda, Johnstown, and Gloversville Railroad branched off. That was a short line railroad, ran out to Gloversville, New York, which was at one point the capital of the world for leather glove manufacture. So that was their main commodity that they hauled. But we're here in the early 1950s. This is October 15th, 1950. Fonda, Johnstown, and Gloversville Alco S2 with a fan trip, 2 cabooses, and some coaches. And it was very common back then for these rail fan excursions, for the rail fans to just climb all over the equipment. And it wasn't necessarily frowned upon back then. So whatever angle they could get to get a picture, obviously when the train was moving they couldn't do that. But when the train was stopped, all bets were off and people were pretty much everywhere. So not uncommon back then, of course today not so common, but just something you saw with all these fan trips around the country that Dana participated in. And we're going to move down into Pennsylvania, the state of Pennsylvania, just outside of Scranton, Pennsylvania. We're here at the Tunkhannock Viaduct in October 1957 on the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad. We've got a fan trip here. This is a New York division of the Railroad Enthusiasts fan trip at the famous viaduct there. We've got some Lackawanna F units pulling a freight coming over, and you can see the fan trip on the right there with Lackawanna passenger equipment. People all over the place, fans all over the place. These passenger fan trip excursions were extremely popular in the 1950s. Now, staying in Pennsylvania, we're going to move on to a very popular subject, the East Broad Top Railroad, which was a narrow gauge steam railroad, which at this point in time in the 1950s was still hauling freight. So we have a coal train here on the East Broad Top Railroad in the 1950s. Eventually, the East Broad Top became a tourist destination and a tourist railroad and operated as that until, I believe, 2013 when they shut down. But just recently, the railroad was acquired by some very high-profile railroad enthusiasts who are planning on resurrecting the East Broad Top. So pretty soon the narrow gauge trains will be hauling passengers again behind steam on the East Broad Top. Now, the East Broad Top interchanged with the Pennsylvania Railroad at Mount Union, Pennsylvania. And the neat thing about this is that the East Broad Top was a narrow gauge operation, and of course Pennsylvania Railroad was a standard gauge operation. So the tracks there at Mount Union were dual gauge. They were set up for both standard gauge and narrow gauge. So you're looking at a great example of dual gauge track here, which was more common out west in places like Colorado than it was on the East Coast, but you do see some examples of that. So some really neat northeast dual gauge track here on the East Broad Top in the 1950s. Our fan trip is going to move on towards Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Railroad now we're going to cover. The East Broad Top was a great segue into that, so we're going to move on to what was called the Standard Railroad of the World, the Pennsylvania Railroad, very famous. We've got a 210-4 steam locomotive here with a coal drag somewhere in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Railroad had some very large steam locomotives, and they actually had some issues during World War II where their locomotives were becoming outdated, but the government would not allow them to purchase new steam locomotives during the war. So they had to run with some outdated steam locomotives for the time being. But we're here in the 1950s, so we're past that point a little bit with a 210-4 once again with a coal drag on the Pennsy. Another shot of a 210-4 leading some coal on the Pennsylvania Railroad. Dana was prolific in his color photography. He first started shooting color in the 1940s and pretty much exclusively shot in color on his trips. He did shoot some black and white, which we do have some black and white images from his collection, but the color slides that he has are fantastic, and they've held up extremely well for being 70, 80 years old. There's absolutely no color correction on many of these images. So you're seeing these scenes the way they were shot by Dana almost 80 years ago in some cases. Now we're going to move over a brief sojourn over into New Jersey. We're here at Atlantic City, New Jersey. A fan trip on the Pennsylvania Railroad here in Atlantic City with steam locomotive number 7133. Really nice period shot. You can see some of the clothing that they wore in the 50s. Some of the photographers milling about, taking some pictures of the power. The railroads were, for the most part, very cooperative with the fan trips and the different clubs that would do these fan trips. They would often line up locomotives for photographers to take pictures of. They would position them in a certain way that was desirable for the photographers. And basically the crews were told by the railroad management to do whatever the fans requested for these trips. So it was just a different thing back then. There was a lot more connection from these large Class 1 railroads with the railroad fan community. We're going to take a trip forward in time to 1972. We're in Strasburg, Pennsylvania, the construction of the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania, which of course today is a fantastic museum, but at this point in time it was still under construction. So Dana got some shots of the facilities being built there in Strasburg. And there you can see the state authority, which has put together the construction of the museum there. A lot of the locomotives were on site at this point. They weren't under wraps, though. They were just sitting outside while the large buildings were constructed for the museum. And of course, Dana walked the short distance across the street to the Strasburg Railroad, which was in operation, of course, in the 1970s, one of the most well-known tourist railroads in the country. And the Strasburg here in 1972 got their coaches there and one of their steam locomotives ready to head out on a trip. Going to drop down into West Virginia now. The Norfolk and Western Railroad was one of the largest railroads in the East Coast, and especially when it came to coal hauling and general freight hauling as well. Some of the locomotives were articulated type steam locomotives, which you see here. We've got Norfolk and Western 2662, number 1452, with a freight train somewhere in West Virginia or Virginia. So getting a little bit south here, but we're looking at the Norfolk and Western now. And then here at Schaefer's Crossing in West Virginia at the shops there, we've got Norfolk and Western A-Class 2664, number 1238, built by the Roanoke shops in 1949. Actually, a side note, the Roanoke shops were just closed recently by Norfolk Southern after a very long period of locomotive maintenance and construction. Looks like we've got a fan trip here, some photographers standing by. Probably Winston Link, the famous photographer who covered the Norfolk and Western in black and white, is probably here somewhere, I would imagine. But fantastic shot of big power on the Norfolk and Western. And then Roanoke, Virginia, was a large point for the Norfolk and Western. So we've got 2882, number 2129 here in the yard with a freight train in Roanoke. Another important spot for the N&W. And a locomotive here that many will recognize, Norfolk and Western J-Class 484, number 611, which was built by Roanoke shops in 1950. 611, of course, was resurrected and is part of the Norfolk Southern steam program. So this locomotive does run today around the country in excursion service. Really nice to see it here in its earlier days. And this is actually pretty recent for this locomotive, with it being built in 1950. It's only a few years old at this point. And at that point in time, diesels were coming into production and being adopted more heavily by the railroads. So the Norfolk and Western was one of the last railroads to manufacture steam locomotives in the United States. And we're going to close out our Norfolk and Western with two shots here of a double-headed steam-powered coal drag, two locomotives, number 2165, that's a 2882 leading, and number 1230, a 2664 behind it, heading up a hill, a steep grade with a coal drag. Pretty neat to see trains like that running at that point in time in the 50s when diesels were becoming more prevalent. We're going to head out to Ohio. We're going to move westward now on our train journey, heading to the Nickel Plate Road in Ohio, the 284 Berkshire Type 729 here leading a freight. The Nickel Plate was one of the last railroads in the United States to use steam locomotives. They used them right up until 1959, 60, and I believe into 61 as well. So pretty late for steam power, but these Berkshire types were very common in Ohio at that point in time. Another shot of a 284 Berkshire type. This is number 757 with a freight in Ohio. This is at Fostoria, Ohio, specifically. Probably around 1954-55. And then at Bellevue, Ohio, in October 22nd, 1952. We've got Nickel Plate Road 284, number 809. Really nice shot here with a steam locomotive still pulling freight on the Nickel Plate Road in the 1950s. Going to jump ahead in time here a little bit. Orville, Ohio, In 1977, actually, this is June 19th, 1977. We've got a Conrail freight here. Conrail crew on the rear of caboose number 18554. Can't see too well, but they're giving him some laughs and smiles here. The crews generally found Dana pretty agreeable. This was a period in time where rail fans were accepted a little bit more by railroad crews. They really understood the fascination better. Oftentimes, many of these rail enthusiasts were employees, and many of these employees were rail enthusiasts. So it wasn't uncommon to get a cab ride or a caboose ride or an agreeable photo opportunity. So really neat to see that in example here as we head around the country and into Canada. Nice shot here at Canton, Ohio in June of 1977, June 21st. Got a Conrail crew as the train comes through the station. This is the former Pennsylvania Railroad, at this point operated by Conrail. Interesting here, if you look at the little shanty there, there's a sign on it that says West Chicago. Now, when I scanned this slide to begin with, there was no labeling on it, so I was a little confused because this says West Chicago, but this doesn't look anything like the West Chicago station. So I did a little research, and the next slide will show you a little bit more about the story. There was another shanty which was labeled East New York. So they had one that said East Chicago and one that said West New York. So it's kind of a little joke there at Canton, Ohio, these little shanties there. So threw me for a loop at first, but a little research proved a good sense of humor on some of these railroad men for sure. Now we're going to move into the state of Illinois. We've got an Illinois Central 282 locomotive number 2818 with a freight train. Really beautiful shot here as the engine runs through on the Illinois Central, one of the most famous railroads in the country, which was still using steam engines well into the 1950s as well. A lot of these railroads couldn't afford to dieselize right away, and especially after World War II when they had been run into the ground. They needed to hold on to the steam power for quite a bit longer. So you'll see that as we head into the Midwest and especially into Canada. We'll see quite a bit of Canadian steam still hanging around into the late 1950s. Another Illinois Central shot. I love this shot. This is a fantastic one. It's at Abbott, Illinois in the 1950s. We got a 210-2 type steam locomotive, number 2745, coming through the station. Got a crew member standing out there. You got the train order boards on the station. Spotless color photography, steam engine at full speed on a main line. You just didn't see photos like this from the 1950s, but Dana had them, and he took them. And it's a great view into many different parts of railroading around the country. Now we're back in Fitchburg, believe it or not, but not Fitchburg, Massachusetts. This is Fitchburg, Wisconsin, on August 7th, 1971. Now, Fitchburg, Wisconsin is a spot that Dana visited almost every time he went to the Midwest, and there's shots of Fitchburg, Wisconsin that pop up in the collection all over the place. Signs that say Fitchburg, Wisconsin, trains running through Fitchburg. So Dana obviously recognized a fellow Fitchburg halfway across the country, and he took as many pictures as he could. But we got an Illinois Central GP10 coming through on a freight. These were rebuilt by the Illinois Central at the Paducah shops in Kentucky. Many of them had been GP7s and GP9s, and they had a massive rebuilding program to rebuild them into GP10s. So that's what you see here. Going to move on now to another Chicago area railroad. The Chicago and Illinois Midland was a very fantastic railroad in the Chicago area of Illinois, and also had one of the most attractive paint schemes for a steam engine, I think. Most of the time you just saw railroads paint steam engines in black, but they had that scarlet stripe with the box herald on the tender. Just a really neat looking paint scheme for a steam locomotive. This is 210-2, number 600, somewhere in Illinois in the 1950s. Doing some switching. It looks like the engineer is hanging out of the cab, so they're either in reverse or doing some switching. Now, Chicago and Illinois Midland had some old diner cars that they would use to feed their crews. So here in 1955 in Illinois, we've got an old Chicago, Illinois Midland diner car, and Dana and his friends have actually stopped in for a bite to eat. So we have closest to the camera, that's H. Arnold Wilder, and behind him is Wayne Brumbo. They're there in the diner having a bite to eat. You can see some of the employees of the Illinois Midland serving food in the background. Really neat shot. You didn't see stuff like this. Most of the time when rail fans went out, they just took pictures of trains passing, but Dana took a picture of just about everything. So we have a lot of really nice insight into the 1950s. Going to move forward in time a little bit here. We're looking at a Burlington Northern Empire builder in July of 1973, July 14th to be exact, at Camp Douglas. Leading is Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy F Unit number 9946, and Dana makes a note that they were 2 hours late. Burlington Northern, when it started out, was one of those merger railroads, so for a few years at the beginning, a lot of their paint was varied on the locomotives and the passenger cars. They still had equipment that had not been painted yet into a standard paint scheme, so you saw Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, Great Northern, all different paint schemes on these consists, so kind of a rainbow here on the Empire Builder early on in the Burlington Northern's career. Going to go back to Chicago to 1949. This is the Chicago Rail Fair in 1949, which has been commented as the last great rail fair in the country. It was pretty common in the 1800s and 1900s for them to have rail fairs where they would take different equipment and put it on display around the country. And Chicago was a pretty common place for that because it was a crossroads of all these different railroads. So Rail Fair 1949, we've got some ancient equipment on display here, Central Pacific equipment. And I believe in the next shot, we have another shot of Rail Fair in 1949. Yeah, it was some more 1800s era equipment. Pretty unusual to see color photography at this point in time, especially something like this. And these slides were in fantastic condition. They didn't take much cleaning up at all. So just a real testament to the storage of these artifacts and the fact that they've held up so well is pretty fantastic. We're going to move up into Wisconsin now. The Milwaukee Road, the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific, was a pretty well-known railroad in the Midwest, and we're here somewhere in Wisconsin with a 262 Prairie type doing some switching. They may very well be switching a brewery for all we know in the Milwaukee area. But the Milwaukee Road was an interesting railroad. They went bankrupt pretty early on, I believe in the late 1970s, maybe around 1980. And their main line through Montana and Idaho out to the West Coast was abandoned. So pretty neat to see the Milwaukee here in the 50s. And we're going to go to Madison, Wisconsin. We got a Milwaukee Road passenger train here. Pretty similar paint scheme to the Union Pacific. I believe there was some joint ownership at some point. I may be mistaken on that. But we got a Milwaukee Road passenger train here in September 1969. That's EMD FP7 number 102 with the train departing Madison Station. St. Louis, Missouri was another railroad crossroads in addition to Chicago. And St. Louis was a place where you saw all kinds of paint schemes and locomotive types. We're here at St. Louis in April of 1950. A Gulfmobile and Ohio E7 number 102 is departing St. Louis Union Station. Really beautiful colors on these locomotives. The color really pops on these slides. And Dana spent quite a bit of time in St. Louis taking different pictures of rolling stock, all different paint schemes and colors. So very cool to see that here on display. Another shot of a GM&O passenger train here at St. Louis departing. Once again, classic locomotive type for the 1950s. Those E units were seen on passenger trains on the Boston and Maine and all over the country as well. Now, St. Louis was such a big railroad town that they actually had a railroad owned by all the different railroads to do the switching. That was the Terminal Railroad Association of St. Louis. So it was a jointly owned switching railroad which would do all the passenger car switching in St. Louis. So we have one of their steam locomotives here. That's Terminal Railroad Association 060 number 170. And a few other slides earlier in this series showed this locomotive being washed and cleaned. So it's a switching locomotive, but at that point in time they were so proud of that they kept these engines clean. Going to jump up further up into the Midwest here. We're at Durand, Michigan. Crossroads for the Grand Trunk Railway in Durand. Pretty important junction for the GT. Now the Grand Trunk was a subsidiary of Canadian National Railways, which operated in the United States. They had the Grand Trunk Western, which operated in the Michigan area, and then they had the Eastern Division of the Grand Trunk, which operated from Canada into Vermont through New Hampshire and into Maine. So the Grand Trunk was owned, of course, by the Canadian National, which would explain the similar paint scheme on their equipment. And using Durand as a launching point, we're going to go over the border into Canada. We are here at Harriston Junction, Ontario, in the 1950s. A Canadian National mixed freight with 260 Mogul type number 86, heading by some semaphores there on the Canadian National. Now, the Canadian National, one of Canada's two large railroads, the other being the Canadian Pacific. Of course, there are some smaller railroads in Canada, but those two stand out as the largest. Held on to steam well into the 1960s, the early 1960s. 1961, I believe 60-61 was when steam finally died out in Canada on the Canadian National. So a really nice shot here of that in the late 1950s in Ontario, which was pretty famous for 260 Mogul types and 460 type steam locomotives. Another example of that at Palmerston, Ontario in the 1950s, Canadian National 460 type number 1576 working in the yard there at Palmerston. And you can see Canadian National diesel in the background, so starting to hint that the diesels are coming in to take over here. But this Canadian steam program did last quite a while longer, as we mentioned, than it did in the United States in most cases. Now, Canadian railroads were famous for running mixed trains, and railroads in the United States did this as well. But out in the prairie country of Canada, it was pretty common to see passenger and freight on the same train. So here we have a mixed train here in Ontario in the 1950s behind a 460 type steam locomotive. Just a classic type of steam locomotive for the Canadian National in that identifiable paint scheme that they had for their locomotives. Now, the Canadian National and the Canadian Pacific were very rail fan friendly in the 1950s. In fact, they ran some of the most fan trips of any railroad in North America. The Canadian National was famous for chartering these fan trips in the 50s. So we've got a fan trip here in Montreal behind 464 number 5702. It's a fan trip, you can tell by all the people milling about. And some photographers today have an aversion to people being in their shots. But back then, there were so many people on these fan trips, it was hard to avoid. But I think it really adds an element to this, especially when you're looking at a historical perspective. Because you get to see the people, the types of people that would go out on these trips, the clothes they were wearing, the cameras they would be using. It just really adds some historical flavor to these fan trip shots. Now, the Canadian National was also well known for running tank engines on their system. The Canadian National rostered a number of 464T tank engines, which ran commuter service in and out of Montreal. And probably the most famous of these was number 47, which you can see here in the 1950s running backwards tank first. This engine was later sold in 1959 to F. Nelson Blount of Steamtown fame for $2,000. This was the very first steam engine ever used by Steamtown in their inaugural 1961 season on the Claremont-Concord branch between Bradford and Mount Sunapee, which is actually about to celebrate its 60th anniversary next year. So that'll be the 60th anniversary of the very first Steamtown operation in New Hampshire on the Claremont-Concord branch, and we're actually planning an article in the B&M Bulletin to go over that, which is going to be a really fantastic commemorative piece, and there may be a larger project in the works on that as well. But number 47, unfortunately, had lost its paperwork in the large engine house fire in Montreal in the 50s, or late 40s, I believe. So it didn't have all its paperwork, and the government stepped in and shut down that first Steamtown operation. So the engine never ran again, and it's at Scranton, Pennsylvania today. Now we're going to head out to Nova Scotia. We're at Antigonish, Nova Scotia in July 1966. We have a Canadian National passenger train here at the station in Nova Scotia. Could be the Scotian, not sure exactly which passenger train it is. But Dana would ride all kinds of Canadian National passenger trains out of Montreal to different parts of Canada. And I would say probably about a third of the nearly 4,500 slides that Dana has in his collection are from Canadian roads. Now we're going to take a trip back south of the border into New Hampshire. We're here at Woodsville, New Hampshire in 1957. Pacific was another one of the large railroads in Canada, and they had American subsidiaries as well. They ran freights into Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, and other places as well, but those three stand out in New England. So we're here in 1957. Canadian Pacific Alco FA1 number 4000 is pulling into Woodsville Yard with a freight off of the Passumpsic River Division. And at the right you can see a Montpelier and Wells River GE 70 tonner with milk cars and a local freight going to head back over their branch to Montpelier, Vermont. So really fantastic shot here. 2 crossroads in Woodsville, New Hampshire. Another shot of Canadian Pacific Alco FAs heading up the Passumpsic line in Vermont, probably heading towards Newport, Vermont, which was just south of the Canadian border. That was a large facility for the Canadian Pacific. But this is pretty early on for the Canadian Pacific and for the diesels, and these Alco type diesels were some of the earliest freight haulers for American and Canadian railroads. Canadian Pacific also ran quite a number of steam excursions as well. This is an excursion somewhere in Quebec with 462 Pacific number 2663 on a rail fan trip. Really beautiful color shot here. This is getting close to the end of steam in Canada, probably around 1956, 57. But they washed all the coaches, they washed the engine, and it was well traveled by rail fans in particular. Going to head back down to Newport, Vermont. This is where we mentioned the Canadian Pacific had a yard and a facility. Got a Canadian Pacific 460 type steam locomotive here in Newport, Vermont. This is in the 1950s. This is probably 1957 or so when Dana took this shot. An older style of steam locomotive. If you'll notice, the headlight is a little bit of an older style, but the Canadian Pacific used steam engines like this on their Vermont branches. They used it on the International of Maine division, and they also used it on their Quebec Central subsidiary as well. And here we have a train on that Quebec Central subsidiary north out of Newport, Vermont, with 2 of those 460s double heading a steam freight train. You don't see a lot of shots of the Quebec Central, and you don't see a lot of shots of the Quebec Central in color. But like I said, this was a Canadian Pacific owned subsidiary, and pretty fantastic to see this. Now we're going to head way out west in Canada to Prince Rupert, British Columbia. This is 1971, July 14th, 1971. We have train number 10 with FP9 number 6504, which is about to leave for Jasper, Alberta, at the station. And on this slide, Dana noted that the engine had extra headlights, quote unquote. Now, ditch lights had not come into large practice on railroads. They were used in Canada first. In the 1970s, and then they slowly made their way into the United States. The Maine Central had ditch lights pretty early on in the late 70s, early 80s. Eventually, by the 1990s, they became mandated by the FRA in the United States. So all engines now that run over crossings at I believe a speed of 20 miles per hour or more are required to have those 2 extra headlights, those ditch lights. But at this point in time, Dana had never seen anything like that before, so we just called them extra headlights. So pretty cool to see that development in progress that early. Now we're going to go to Jasper, Alberta, a pretty important division point for the Canadian National here in the Rockies of Canada. Got a freight heading through with F7 leading, number 9084. Behind that, GP9, number 4215, and an SD40 pulling up the rear, number 5139. Dana visited Jasper at least twice, from what I can tell in his slides. He was mostly riding the Supercontinental, which ran from Montreal to Vancouver across the continent and went right through Jasper. Another shot at Jasper, an SD40-led passenger train being serviced. Fantastic view of the Rockies behind it. And it looks like they're actually putting ditch lights onto the locomotive. And that was noted on the slide as well. So I'm not sure if they took them off and put them on at certain points, or maybe they used them in tunnels. But it seems to be that the Canadian National kind of pioneered that trend. So kind of cool to see that. Head back into the States. We're going to jump way back east to Pennsylvania. We're here in Gallatin, Pennsylvania in the early 1950s, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad on the former Buffalo and Susquehanna Railroad. We've got 2 280 consolidations here, number 3127 and 3134, and they're actually about to head out both on a train, as you'll see. They would use one on the point of the train, and they would use one about halfway down the train to get through the hilly terrain in that area. And here you see that. 1 280 on the lead, then about 5 cars back, we've got another steam locomotive, and then more freight behind that. But they're stopping at a water tank to water the locomotives here in the Gallatin, Pennsylvania area in the 1950s. Once again, this used to be the Buffalo and Susquehanna. It was acquired by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in the 50s, and then eventually became the Wellsville, Addison, and Gallatin short line. Another shot, this is the helper locomotive halfway through the freight train being watered at the water tank. So real mountain railroading, you didn't see this type of thing in too many other places. Another popular northeastern railroad was the Lehigh and New England Railroad, which ran New York, Pennsylvania in that area. So here we are in May of 1949, a fan trip on the Lehigh, New England. We've actually got a Lackawanna steam locomotive at right, 484 steam locomotive, which powered this New York division of the Railroad Enthusiasts fan trip. And they've got some Lehigh, New England FA power at left. Going to go up into New England now. We're getting back onto the home stretch, so we're heading back to home territory. The New Haven Railroad, the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad was another famous New England railroad. Here we are in 1953, May 3rd, 1953. This is a Railroad Enthusiasts fan trip with DL 109, number 0722, the Cranberry, in the lead, obviously named for the passenger trains which ran out to Cape Cod on the New Haven Railroad. So pretty nice to see this in color. This was a fantastic railroad. The New Haven was very well known by New England and nationwide rail fans. Jump forward in time a little bit. July 17th, 1965, we have the Apple Blossom Special, another Railroad Enthusiasts fan trip to Torrington, Connecticut. So Dana, of course, was a member of the Railroad Enthusiasts, so he would go to all their fan trips, take pictures. This was one of them on the New Haven Railroad with Bud RDCs. There's actually an RDC and a similar paint scheme up at the Hobel Railroad right now. So you can see some of these running around in New England. Now, the New Haven also ran steam power into the 1950s, but they dieselized pretty early. And a good reason for that is that most of the passenger trains which ran between Boston and New York City ran on the New Haven Railroad. So they had a lot of electric locomotives, they had a lot of diesel locomotives, so they were pretty quick to dieselize. But we have a fan trip here at Willimantic, Connecticut in June 1949. This is a fan trip over the New Haven, and they have a 462 Pacific number 1357 doing the honors here on that day. Another shot of the fan trip there at Willimantic. It's actually Arnold Wilder there, right next to me at left with his camera. Of course, Arnold was Dana's best friend. They traveled to all these locations together, so he shows up in quite a few of Dana's photographs. And we're going to move on to the New Haven's Airline in Lyman, Connecticut. This is the Lyman Viaduct in 1949. This is the same fan trip. Now, this was actually a bridge, and the New Haven filled it in. They just dumped a bunch of fill right off the bridge and filled it up. So there's actually a bridge underneath all of that fill, and it's still there today. It's a rail trail today, but the bridge is still there under all of that earth. It's pretty incredible. Now we're going to move further into New England. We're up in Massachusetts, South Carver, Massachusetts. The Edaville Railroad was established in the cranberry bog country around South Carver by Ellis Atwood. He was an entrepreneur, and he was responsible for owning a lot of the cranberry production in that area. So he actually took a lot of the narrow gauge equipment from the narrow gauge railroads in Maine, which were shutting down in the late 30s, early 1940s, moved it down to Edaville and built his own railroad to help with cranberry production. Eventually that stopped, so he would just use the trains to carry passengers, tourists. It was a tourist attraction. So we've got the Edaville Railroad here. I believe these were taken in 1950 specifically. Another shot on the Edaville, a steam doubleheader at twilight. These were frequented by rail fans. It was a community that would go down. They would ride these trains, take pictures. So it's not uncommon to see a lot of familiar faces, a lot of familiar names show up at Edaville in the 40s and 50s. Another shot of a steam doubleheader in 1950 on the Edaville Railroad. It's actually Donald S. Robinson at right, wearing his conductor's cap. He was a Boston and Maine employee. He was a towerman. He worked in Gardner. He was a dispatcher as well. And he was a very prolific photographer as well, and a rail fan. So these guys intermingled and they commingled. Employees of the Boston and Maine, rail fans. They were a very tight community. And a steam quadruple header on the Edaville Railroad. You don't see that very often, but we've got 4 steam locomotives here pulling a train on the Edaville Railroad. Now, Ellis Atwood unfortunately was killed in an explosion on the Edaville Railroad. I believe had something to do with cranberry production. A piece of machinery exploded, and he passed away from that. And then his widow sold the railroad to Nelson Blount, who, of course, eventually started Steamtown. Head further up into Massachusetts, we're on the Boston and Albany Railroad here with a passenger train, 482, number 3004, at Southville, Massachusetts. The Boston and Albany was a subsidiary of the New York Central Railroad, so it wasn't uncommon to see New York Central passenger power leading trains on the Boston and Albany Railroad. And here's an example of that. We've got a New York Central E7A, number 4021, leading a passenger train somewhere on the Boston and Albany around 1950 or so. And I believe Dana's color photography actually started on the Boston and Albany, which is interesting to note, even though he was from Fitchburg. Now we're going to jump way up into the state of Maine here. June 13th, 1954, Bangor, Maine. This is the last steam run on the Maine Central Railroad. We've got the governor of Maine, Burton Cross, at left. And at right, the president of the Maine Central Railroad, E. Spencer Miller. They're standing on the front of number 470, a 462 Pacific locomotive which ran that last steam trip. That locomotive is actually at the Down East Scenic today, being restored to operation by the New England Steam Corporation. So it's actually being worked on as we speak. They've been doing work here in June. I've been noticing they've been doing some work on the tender and the trucks as well. So interesting development to follow. Then we're going to move into Bartlett, New Hampshire on the Maine Central's Mountain Division. We've got a steam-powered passenger train on the Maine Central heading out of Bartlett. Of course, Bartlett is a famous location for railroading and is still used by the Conway Scenic today. So if you want to ride the Maine Central's Mountain Division, you can still do that. It probably won't be a steam engine like this, but still very neat that you can do that in this day and age. And we're going to jump up to the state of Maine here again. We'd be remiss if we talked about Maine without mentioning the Bangor and Aroostook, probably one of the most famous railroads in Maine. And this is a BL2 type locomotive, number 554. The BL2 was probably one of the earliest diesel switchers. The electromotive division was experimenting with diesel switchers, and the BL2 was the first real viable option that the EMD released. It wasn't hugely successful, but it did pave the way for the later GP series locomotives. But the Bangor and Aroostook rostered several BL2s from the 1950s right up until the 1970s. They used these antique locomotives. And we've actually seen one in person. There's one down in Honesdale, Pennsylvania, running on the Stourbridge Railroad. And really neat to see the BL2s still operating. And then we're going to move once again to the Bangor and Aroostook. We're here in 1952. We've got an E7, number 701, the Bangor and Aroostook. Very possible this was used on the Bangor and Aroostook's Potato Land passenger train. That was their famous passenger train that they operated. They got out of passenger service pretty early. So these engines were actually later transferred to freight service, I understand. These large E units were re-geared for freight service. But here in 52, still being used in passenger service on the B&A. And it's funny because most people identify the B&A as the Boston and Albany, but if you go up to northern Maine, don't you dare identify the B&A as the Boston and Albany, because to them, it's the Bangor and Aroostook. Back in home territory here, we're on the Boston and Maine in Westford, Massachusetts. This is on the spur to the H.E. Fletcher Granite Company, which is still in operation. They haven't used their railroad spur in quite a while, but they still do produce granite in Westford. That's actually Arnold Wilder on his horse Laddie. Looks like the cavalry's arrived. Westford was the home of Arnold, so it wasn't too hard for him to just make his way down there and check out the action. And we're going to close our rail trip here back home in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, March 1949, 060 switcher, number 423, same family as our 410 in Lowell, with a caboose there at the East Fitchburg Engine House. So we hope you enjoyed this trip around the country with us here, looking at some different things that Dana Goodwin shot. It's only a very small fraction of the over 4,000 slides in Dana's collection, but we hope you've been able to enjoy some of this. We've got some announcements here for you. No word yet on in-person meetings for the Society, but our store is back open at full capacity. So if you're interested in merchandise, you can head over there and support the Society. All funds go to support our operations. You can also donate if you so desire. A few different items we'd like to point out here which are new to the store. We have for the HO modeler some kits. We have just the basics by the Bollinger Edgerly Scale Trains Company. It's a ball signal kit. So if you want to have Maine Central, Boston and Maine style ball signals on your layout, perfect wooden kit. We actually have one on our layout here up in Moultonborough. So a really nice kit there if you like the ball signals. And then we've got crossing shanties, which were used by the Boston and Maine for crossing tender guards all over the system. So if you're modeling the 40s, 50s, 30s, even into the 1960s, probably something you would see on the Boston and Maine. So just a couple of options there on the website if you're interested in modeling. And of course we have our videos, books, and apparel as well. We've got kind of an interesting idea here. We'd like to help support the tourist railroads around the country right now. Most of them are opening up or have already opened up, but are able to run at half capacity, and most of them are pretty strapped for cash. So if you ride a tourist railroad anywhere in the country or abroad, if you live abroad, take a picture of yourself with the ticket and send it to us on Messenger, and we'll enter you into a drawing to win a t-shirt from us. And that's a great way to support some of these railroads, which are really hurt for cash right now, and they could really support your patronage, as if you needed more motivation to go ride a train. But there you go. Some more good news for you here. We've got production starting again on the Minuteman Tales videos. We're getting back into shooting those. We're going to start the next season with some video shot on the Conway branch of the Boston and Maine. So that's going to be coming up here pretty soon. We're going to get out and shoot. And then we've got a video which is going to air this Wednesday. It is a recording of a motor car ride on the Hillsborough branch of New Hampshire. And it's actually narrated to some passages from the famous 1950 book High Green and the Bark Peelers, in which the author rode a freight train on the Hillsborough branch. So you'll be able to ride along with us in the modern day and hear some narration from 1950. So that's going to be a really neat video. Before we close, we'd like to ask if anybody has any questions about any of the photos you saw today, anything that Dana shot, or anything about the society in general. We'll take a minute here to pause for questions. If you're leaving us, we appreciate you coming and watching us. As always, we appreciate your attention to the B&M Society, and we hope you have a fantastic rest of your weekend. Stay cool if you can. Well, it doesn't look like any questions are popping up. If you have any afterwards, you can comment on the video. It will be available to watch again as many times as you'd like on our Facebook page, or you can shoot us a message on Facebook. Have a great day, everybody.